Just going by the numbers, 1988 doesn't seem like it's going to be a big year for the PC Engine. There's just 22 games getting released. And the edge that the platform enjoys of being the most technologically advanced game console on the market won't even last until the end of the year. But 1988 is when the PC Engine finds its feet. Almost every game released for the platform this year is a classic in some way or another. And the most significant shift in video games since Jerry Lawson said, "What if people could switch out the games they were playing on this machine?" And we're kicking things off with Jaseiken Necromancer, the very first RPG for the PC Engine. RPGs are a genre where the PC Engine was actually at a disadvantage compared to other platforms, at least at first. You didn't need a fancy 16-bit video processor to make a decent RPG. You just had to put enemies on the screen, show a map, and give players locations to explore. So the Famicom was able to play those just fine. In fact, just 1 week before the release of the PC Engine, Hudson released one of the earliest RPGs on the Famicom, Momotaro Densetsu. That was a pretty big hit on the Famicom too, where after the wild success of Dragon Quest II, very few game developers were prepared to release their own games in that nascent genre. Of course, 1988 was when all of that changed as well. By the end of the year, RPGs would be well on their way to being the dominant genre of video games in Japan. And unfortunately for Necromancer, the herald of that dramatic shift in the industry was released just 3 weeks after it. On February 10th, while Necromancer was still finding its feet sales-wise, Dragon Quest III was released, an event that literally shut down the country of Japan. No RPG, no matter how many levels it grinded up, could possibly defeat that boss monster. There are a few things that made Necromancer stand out on the shelves at least. The obvious one is the cover, and that's because Necromancer is the first game to license the art of H.R. Giger. Giger started getting a lot of wide attention as an artist because of his design work on the Alien movies. And regardless of anything else, I'll give Necromancer this: it's the best video game directly inspired by his artwork.
That sure was some nightmare. It even left me with a monster headache.
There's actually only one piece of Giger art used in the game, and that's the illustration used for the cover and the hue card. It's a cropped portion of The Spell 3, whose design happened to be inspired by the helmet of Takeda Shingen, a 16th century Japanese warlord who's going to come up quite a few times as I go through the PC Engine library. The rest of the Gigerish art in the game, including the face that appears in the introduction, are actually drawn by Hudson artist Akinobu Sekiguchi, mimicking Giger's style. The art book featuring Giger's work that was available in 1988 was titled Necronomicon, after the book of unspeakable horrors found in H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. And the reason I bring that up is that Necromancer is the first Lovecraftian console game. There's a few computer games I can think of that predate it, but for home consoles, this was the first. And most of that just comes down to using certain names and visual designs. All of the bosses are various gods and monsters from the Cthulhu mythos, and not necessarily all by Lovecraft himself. The Cthulhu mythos is the collective term for a story cycle that encompasses most of the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, as well as works by those he corresponded with like Clark Ashton Smith, Ronnie Howard, and several others. The stories often dealt with unspeakable things lurking just at the edges of our perception, and if someone were to be directly confronted with them, it would drive them mad. These concepts were all bundled up by Sandy Peterson into an RPG that he titled Call of Cthulhu. And when that RPG got released in Japan in 1986, it became a surprise hit of the then just underway Japanese RPG scene. Necromancer has a lot of pen and paper RPG influences, and those of Call of Cthulhu are especially notable, because the pen and paper RPG had a sanity mechanic, where the longer a character adventured, the more likely it was that they would go insane. And there's actually something similar to that in Necromancer. Now, despite all of that, the plot of the game is pretty straightforward. There were gods, there were demons, they had a war, and the gods made a weapon too terrible to keep. Jaseiken Necromancer. The gods broke the weapon up and hid it across the world, but now the demons are coming back and screwing around with the humans, so you, as the hero, are tasked with reassembling it. The Jaseiken of the title is actually a little bit funky. Seiken is a term that comes up in a lot of RPGs. It's a holy sword, or sacred blade, or whatever you want to call it. But the character at the beginning that the Ja comes from means evil or wicked. There's an inherent contradiction meshed together in that one word, which is why I chose to translate it as the profane holy sword, but there's no real correct way to do it. There's actually a lot of wordplay used in the game along those lines. Choices made to emphasize the wrongness of things. When you start the game, you're by yourself, and your first task is to go meet the wise man at the palace, who introduces you to 5 possible companions. And here you have to select 2 of them to be your party. Your main character is always male, but 4 of the 5 possible party members are women. You've got your pick between a strong magic user, a buff fighter, a powerful healer, a nimble thief, or an average all-arounder. You pick 2 of them to go with you, and the choice makes an enormous difference in the game. The reason is that one stat is really dominant in the game: agility. If you pick somebody who doesn't have strong agility, then in the late game they will go last in combat, not be able to hit anybody, and not get the advantage of extra attacks that come with a high agility. The recommended party to have an easy time getting through the game is the Mage Lime and the Thief Maced. And once you have your party selected, it's time to grind. And you will need to grind a lot. Necromancer is an absolutely brutal RPG. You'll probably need to be about level 4 before you can safely get to the second town, and that's about an hour of grinding. I managed to push my way through using healing herbs, but once there, it was a 50-50 shot on whether or not any battle I encountered outside of town would kill me. To help you with your grinding, the encounter rate is absurdly high. Now, I know that these early RPGs are known for having you get into a lot of fights, but it is extremely common in Necromancer for the next fight to be 1 step away. In battle, you have the usual options to fight, cast a spell, use an item, or run away. Every character has to run away individually, and that's another place where agility will help you. Something that you'll notice is that there's a lot of blood and gore with the monster designs here. These zombies with their entrails spilling out could easily be the first monster that you encounter. This dark and violent tone got played up in the commercials for the game, where players were instructed to not play it with the lights out. Also, that monster gets decapitated and blood sprays everywhere. As the PC Engine goes on, it's going to become more and more a platform for the mature audiences. And you can put some finger quotes around mature audiences, because what that really means is blood and boobs. And Necromancer is really the leading edge of that. Fresh equipment is absurdly expensive, and there is no armor shop in the first town. So you can't even properly protect yourself until you've made a big pile of cash. When you level up, your stats change, and how they change is predetermined. But one aspect to this is that at a certain point, character stats start going down when you level up. Every character has a different level progression, and a different point at which they start getting hit by those decreases. The hero that you control is especially vulnerable to this, and you're almost definitely going to be affected by it before you get to the end of the game. Spells work just like other equipment, except it's even more expensive to get. The 2 native spellcasters start with at least something, but everybody else has to buy it. The other thing that you have to buy are your passwords. Because there's no non-volatile storage on the hue card, RPGs based on that have to use passwords. And the passwords for Necromancer are absurdly long. There's also apparently no checksumming of them, which means if you enter the wrong thing, you could very easily cause all sorts of weird results. Restoring the game from a password is also how you deal with one of Necromancer's stranger game mechanics, and that's the fear checks that your party undergoes. Actions that you take as you play adjust a fear level for each character, and in combat they do a check every turn to see if they're just too scared to do anything and will run away instead. This occurs even at the final boss. For a long time, people weren't completely sure that this mechanic existed in the game. They just knew that the characters would run away from time to time. But when Necromancer was re-released in 2020, some fans of the game reverse-engineered the code and finally identified the things that affect that fear mechanic. One of the big ones was restoring the game from the password, because the fear level isn't saved, so when you restore, it goes back to default. Unfortunately, I didn't really have an opportunity to explore the dungeons, but they're all very dark, and even if you have a light source, you can't see very far. If you find a chest, then you'll need to decide who will touch it, because of course this is the kind of game that has trapped chests. These days, Necromancer is mainly remembered for being that brutally difficult PC Engine RPG. But there were enough people who remembered it fondly that it wound up getting a remake as a flip phone game. And that release of Necromancer turned out to be a big hit, which meant that 21 years after the original game's release, it got a sequel. And unfortunately, that sequel has not been preserved or is available online anymore. I have to say, I find Necromancer to be kind of interesting. It's definitely not a top-tier RPG. Even by 1988 standards, it's brutal and cruel, and the environments that you explore don't really hold up. But there are a lot of mechanics that you just didn't find in RPGs at the time. Necromancer was bringing over a lot of pen and paper influence, when most people were just copying Dragon Quest and calling it a day. I can't say I recommend playing it, but that doesn't mean that Necromancer isn't fascinating.